It was Christmas Eve in Chicago, the kind of night where the wind off Lake Michigan cuts through bone when my parents parked their SUV in front of St. Jude's Children's Home. I was 17, just months away from high school graduation, yet they handed me a small suitcase and a note, as if I were a toddler they'd grown tired of playing with. "We've given you everything we can, Tina. It's time for you to find your own path," my father said, his breath hitching in the frost. Sister Bernadette, the home's director, stepped into the biting cold as my mother, clad in a designer wool coat, climbed back into the car without a single word of farewell. I stood on the icy sidewalk, clutching my suitcase, watching their taillights disappear into the swirling snow. The festive lights draped over the orphanage's iron gates felt like a cruel mockery, twinkling brightly while my world went dark. "Come inside, child," Sister Bernadette whispered, her hand warm on my shivering shoulder. "The hearth is lit, and you are safe now." But I didn't want the hearth. I wanted to know how the people who raised me for 17 years could discard me like a piece of unwanted holiday tinsel. The final months before my 18th birthday at St. Jude's shaped me in ways I wouldn't understand until much later. Sister Bernadette became my anchor, teaching me that abandonment didn't define my worth, especially when the holiday season made the pain feel unbearable. "Tina," she'd say as we sat by the chapel's nativity scene, "you have a fire inside you that the winter cannot quench." She encouraged my obsession with the law, helping me find the library's quiet corners where I could study the statutes that govern parental responsibility and child welfare. By the time the snow began to melt, I was devouring legal precedents, hungry for knowledge that could explain how parents could legally walk away from a child just because the contract of childhood was nearing its end. "You're brilliant," Sister Bernadette told me as I analyzed the home's own charter. "Your mind is your greatest shield. Never let the coldness of others make you feel small." The younger children looked up to me as the big sister who was always studying, and I realized then that my education was the only way to ensure I never felt powerless again. At 18, I aged out of the system and was briefly taken in by the Miller family, a practical couple in the Chicago suburbs who specialized in helping transitional youth. Sarah and David Miller were kind, but they ran their home with a rigid, professional distance that reminded me my stay was merely a bridge to a life I had to build myself. "Tina, we provide the roof and the resources, but the foundation is yours to pour," Sarah explained as she helped me fill out FAFSA forms. I appreciated their pragmatism, having learned that family was often a fragile concept that could break under the weight of a holiday season. "I understand," I replied, working 3 jobs while finishing my senior year. David worked as a transit foreman and Sarah as a social worker, and their modest home felt like a fortress against the uncertainty of the streets. "Your biological parents technically followed the letter of the law for abandonment of a near adult," Sarah told me gently. I nodded, though the holiday carols on the radio still felt like a personal insult. "Do you still look for them in crowds?" she asked. "I look for answers," I admitted, "not for them." College at the University of Chicago became my proving ground, where I channeled the winter of my abandonment into an academic drive that stunned my professors. "Tina, your grasp of family law and civil litigation is beyond your years," said Dr. Aristos, my pre-law advisor, during a winter term review. "You are focusing on the mechanics of justice with a precision that borders on surgical." I explained that I'd been planning my career since that night at the gates of St. Jude's, saving every cent and applying for every grant available to a ward of the state. "I'm going to Denver for law school," I told him. "I want to be where the system is being rewritten, where I can protect the vulnerable from the people who are supposed to love them." Dr. Aristos smiled, seeing the steel in my gaze. "Resilience isn't just about bouncing back, it's about moving forward with intent." He helped me secure a full-ride scholarship to the University of Denver, writing a letter that highlighted my unflinching dedication to the ethics of guardianship. When the acceptance letter arrived on a snowy April morning, it felt like the first warm day I'd known in years. Law school in Denver opened a world where I could finally put a name to the injustice I had suffered. My mentor, Professor Elena Rossi, recognized the cold motivation that drove me to specialize in child advocacy and parental liability. Tina, you treat every mock trial like a real battle for a child's soul, she noted after I won a regional competition. I shared the story of my 17th Christmas, the suitcase, and the note. The system allows for soft abandonment of teenagers, I told her. Parents wait until the child is almost grown, then cut them loose to avoid the costs of college or adulthood, leaving deep psychological scars. Professor Rossi nodded, her expression grave. That lived experience is your greatest asset in court, but it can also be your greatest burden if you don't process it. She encouraged me to seek counseling, helping me see that my legal career shouldn't just be a weapon for revenge, but a tool for systemic healing. The best advocates, she said, are those who have walked through the fire and chosen to become the water. My therapist, Dr. Marcus Thorne, helped me navigate the complicated anger of a teenager discarded just before the finish line. Tina? Being left at 17 is a specific kind of trauma, he explained during our sessions in a quiet office overlooking the Rockies. It's a betrayal of the promise that home is a place that stays. Through difficult conversations, I began to see that my parents' decision was a reflection of their own moral bankruptcy, not a flaw in my character. You were almost an adult, but you were still their daughter, Dr. Thorne reminded me. Nothing you could have done justified being left on a sidewalk on Christmas Eve. I began to detach my worth from their approval, though my legal mind still craved a different kind of closure. Will I ever stop wanting them to see what they lost? I asked. You can't control their sight, he replied, but you can make your life so bright they can't help but notice the glow. These sessions taught me that my pursuit of the law was my way of reclaiming the narrative of my own life. By my final year of law school, I was clerking for Judge Maria Vargas in the Denver Family Court, seeing the festive decorations in the lobby as a reminder of the cases that often peaked during the holidays. Tina, your briefs on parental neglect are the most thorough I've ever seen, Judge Vargas commented after I'd researched a complex case involving the dumping of a foster teen. You see the legal loopholes that parents use to evade their moral obligations. I explained that my insight came from a suitcase left in a Chicago snowdrift. I know how the law can be used as a shield for the heartless, I said, and I want to turn it into a sword for the voiceless. Judge Vargas became a second mentor, showing me how to balance legal rigor with the empathy required for family law. The law is a cold instrument, she told me. It needs people like you to give it a heartbeat. She recommended me to Sterling & Associates, a firm known for taking on high-stakes advocacy cases, ensuring I had a platform to start my crusade. At Sterling & Associates, I quickly became known as the advocate of the abandoned, building a practice that focused on the rights of older foster youth and victims of parental fraud. My senior partner, Arthur Sterling, was impressed by my ability to find hidden assets in cases where parents claimed poverty to avoid supporting their children. Tina, you have a bloodhound's nose for financial deception, he noted during my annual review. Our clients trust you because they know you've stood where they are standing. I represented teenagers who had been kicked out of perfect suburban homes, ensuring they received the educational trusts and support they were legally owed. Every case is a chance to right a wrong that was done to me, I told Arthur. Every child I help is a victory against that Christmas night in Chicago. He saw that my passion translated into an unbeaten record in the courtroom. You aren't just winning cases, he observed during a firm holiday party. You're building a new standard for parental accountability. 10 years into my career, I had become one of Denver's most formidable attorneys, with a life that was a testament to my own strength. My home was a mountain retreat filled with warmth, a far cry from the drafty halls of St. Jude's. I had founded the Bernadette Hope Foundation, which provided legal and financial aid to kids aging out of the system, ensuring they never had to face a Chicago winter alone. Tina, the foundation has helped 500 students reach college this year, my lead coordinator, Marcus, reported. That's 500 futures saved. I had built a legacy out of the ashes of my own childhood, at turning the pain of that suitcase into a beacon of hope for others. Sister Bernadette used to say my mind was my greatest gift, I told Marcus. I'm just finally using it the way she intended. The work was my redemption, a way to ensure that the note my parents left was never the final word on any child's life. The call that reopened the wounds came on a Tuesday morning in December as snow began to blanket the Denver streets. "Miss Thompson, this is Detective Mark Reynolds from Chicago PD," the voice said, sounding like a ghost from my past. "I'm calling regarding a cold case investigation into the Harmony Transition Agency." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I remember that name," I whispered. "That was the consultancy my parents used before they left me." Detective Reynolds sighed heavily over the line. "We've uncovered a massive fraud ring. It wasn't just transitional help, Tina. It was an illegal scheme where wealthy parents paid to have their difficult older children processed out of their lives through forged emancipation papers and kickbacks to shady institutions." The world seemed to stop spinning as the truth began to emerge. "You mean it wasn't just a choice?" I asked. "It was a crime?" "It was a business," Reynolds replied. "And your parents were among their top clients." Detective Reynolds explained that the Harmony Agency had specialized in discreetly resolving family burdens for the elite, often using forged documents to strip children of their inheritance or trust funds before dumping them at charities. "Miss Thompson, we found a ledger. Your parents paid $50,000 to relinquish you and ensure you would have no legal claim to the Vance family estate," he said. The air left my lungs as if I'd been punched. I hadn't just been abandoned. I'd been defrauded of my own identity and future by the people who shared my DNA. "They paid $50,000 to get rid of me?" I repeated, the lawyer in me already calculating the damages. "Yes, and they used that same agency to recruit other wealthy families into the scheme to earn back their investment," Reynolds added. I sat in my high-back leather chair, looking out at the mountains, realizing that my parents weren't just cold. They were predators who had turned my life into a tax write-off. "I'm coming to Chicago," I said, "and I want to see every file you have." The meeting at the Chicago precinct revealed a level of depravity I hadn't even imagined in my darkest hours. Detective Reynolds laid out a map of a criminal enterprise that spanned 3 states, with the Vance family, my parents, at the center of the recruitment wing. "Arthur and Elena Vance didn't just dump you, Tina," Reynolds explained. "They became consultants for other families, teaching them how to use the Harmony Agency to cleanly exit their parental duties without losing social standing." I looked at photos of my parents at gala events in Aspen, smiling and clinking glasses, while the files showed bank transfers from desperate, misguided mothers they had manipulated. "They built a second fortune on the abandonment of children," I whispered, the cold fury from 17 years ago returning with a vengeance. The records showed they owned a multi-million-dollar estate in Aspen, funded in part by the commissions they earned from the Harmony Agency. "They prospered while I was eating day-old bread at St. Jude's," I said, my voice as sharp as a winter gale. The investigation was now a federal matter, and because of my legal standing, I was invited to act as a special consultant to the prosecution. The statute of limitations for the abandonment itself is tricky, the federal prosecutor told me, but the wire fraud, the racketeering, and the forgery are all very much alive. I spent nights in a Chicago hotel room, sifting through the evidence of my parents' greed, feeling the holiday spirit outside my window like a cruel joke. "They used my social security number to open offshore accounts," I noted, showing the investigators a trail of digital breadcrumbs. "They weren't just abandoning me. They were stealing my future to fund their present." Every document I turned over was another nail in the coffin of the Vance family name. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the lead architect of their downfall, using the very skills I'd honed to survive to ensure they never survived this. "I want to be there when the warrants are served," I told the lead agent. "I want them to see the path I found." Finding Arthur and Elena Vance was easy. They were hosting their annual Winter Wonderland charity gala at their Aspen mansion. I drove up the winding mountain roads on a Saturday, the same day I had once been left on a sidewalk, feeling the weight of the justice I carried in my briefcase. The mansion was a palace of glass and light, perched on a cliffside, a monument to the entitlement that had discarded me. I sat in my car for an hour, watching the elite of Aspen arrive in furs and silks before stepping out into the snow. I didn't look like a frightened 17-year-old anymore. I looked like the high-powered attorney who was about to dismantle their world. "It's time for the past to come home for the holidays," I whispered to the cold mountain air. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, the same ones that had been closed to me for a decade and a half, ready to show them that some debts can never be settled with a check. I bypassed the security with my federal credentials, walking into the grand ballroom as the band played a soft, upbeat version of Silent Night. When Elena Vance saw me, she didn't recognize me at first, not until I stood directly in her path, the light of the chandelier reflecting in my eyes. "Hello, Mother," I said, the words cutting through the chatter of the room like a blade. "I believe you have some unfinished business to attend to." She gasped, her champagne glass trembling as the recognition finally dawned on her, a look of pure, unadulterated terror crossing her face. Arthur appeared at her side, his face reddening with a mix of shock and the old arrogance he'd used on the Chicago sidewalk. "Tina, you have no right to be here. This is a private event," he stammered. "I have every right," I replied, pulling the federal warrants from my coat. "In fact, I'm the one who signed off on the evidence that's about to end this party." I watched as the color drained from their faces, the festive music suddenly feeling like a funeral march. The confrontation moved to their private study, away from the prying eyes of their wealthy friends, as federal agents began securing the premises. "You paid the Harmony Agency $50,000 to erase me," I began, my voice a calm, steady rhythm that offered no room for escape. "You forged my signature on emancipation documents while I was still a minor, and then you recruited 3 other families into the same scheme." Arthur tried to bluster, claiming they were protecting the family's reputation and that I had been rebellious, but I cut him off with a stack of bank statements. "You were protecting your bottom line, Arthur," I said. "You saw your daughter as a liability to be liquidated, and then you turned around and made it a business model." Elena began to weep, but I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, just the cold satisfaction of a case being closed. "I grew up in the cold so I could learn how to handle people like you," I told her. "And now the winter has finally arrived for the Vances. They tried to offer me money, a settlement to make the charges go away, showing that they still didn't understand who I had become." "We can set up a trust, Tina. We can make this right," Elena sobbed, reaching for my hand. I pulled back as if her touch were ice. "You can't buy back the years at St. Jude's," I replied. "And you certainly can't buy a partner at Sterling & Associates." I explained the federal charges in clinical detail: racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and identity theft. "The evidence is ironclad because I spent the last 6 months making sure of it," I said. "I didn't just find the trail, I paved it all the way to this room." Michael looked at the business card I'd placed on the desk, the one that labeled me as a specialist in child advocacy and parental liability. "You did this?" he whispered. "I didn't do this," I corrected him. "You did this 17 years ago. I'm just the one who's here to collect the interest." The revelation of my role in the federal task force broke whatever remained of their composure. When the lead agent entered to begin the formal arrests, Arthur looked at me with a desperate, hollow hope. "You're our daughter, Tina. You can't let them do this to us," he pleaded. I looked at the man who had left me in the Chicago wind and felt a profound sense of distance. "A daughter is someone you protect," I said. "A daughter is someone you sacrifice for. I was a transaction to you, and now the transaction has defaulted." I watched as they were handcuffed in their own study, surrounded by the luxury they'd bought with the futures of the children they'd discarded. "The statute of limitations on my abandonment might be an issue," I added as they were led away, "but the crimes you committed to cover it up will keep you away for a very long time." The festive lights of the mansion seemed to dim as the reality of their situation took hold. As they were being led to the police cruisers, I stood on the grand balcony, watching the snow fall over the Aspen Valley. The winter wonderland they'd built was melting into a legal nightmare of their own making. "You helped separate children from their identities for profit," I shouted as they reached the cars. "You turned the sacred bond of family into a franchise." Elena looked back one last time, her face a mask of regret and fear, but I turned my back on her, just as she had turned her back on me 17 years ago. The air was cold, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel a chill. I felt the warmth of a life built on truth, a life that had survived their betrayal and emerged stronger. "The Harmony Agency is gone," I whispered to the night, "and so are the Vances." I walked back through the empty ballroom, past the half-eaten hors d'oeuvres and abandoned champagne, feeling the weight of the suitcase I'd carried for 15 years finally lift from my soul. The meeting concluded with the federal agents taking possession of all their files, a treasure trove of evidence that would bring down the entire Harmony network. "You've done an incredible service here, Tina," the lead agent said, shaking my hand. "We couldn't have cracked this without your specific insight into their methods." I nodded, feeling a quiet sense of pride that Sister Bernadette would have shared. "It wasn't just about them," I said. "It was about making sure no other 17-year-old ever feels the way I did on that sidewalk." I drove down the mountain as the sun began to rise on a new day, the aspen trees glowing like silver in the morning light. I called Dr. Thorne and told him it was over, that the ghost of the Chicago Christmas had finally been laid to rest. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I feel like I've finally come home," I replied, "and this time the doors are open." "You were never my parents," I had told them as they were being led away. "You were just the people who gave me a reason to become the woman I am today." I realized that their betrayal had been the fuel for my success, the dark backdrop that made my own light shine more brightly. Sister Bernadette had been right. My mind was my greatest gift, and I had used it to build a sanctuary for myself and thousands of others. The Miller family had shown me that stability was something you earned, and I had earned it tenfold. My rejection of them wasn't born of hate. It was born of a fundamental understanding that we were no longer of the same world. "You traded a daughter for a commission," I had said, "and you lost both." As I crossed the state line back into Denver, I felt a peace that no holiday carol could ever provide. I was Tina Thompson, and I was whole. Walking away from that Aspen mansion was the true beginning of my life. I wasn't the powerless teen anymore. I was the architect of my own justice. I spent the rest of the week in Denver, finalizing the foundation's holiday gala, ensuring that every foster youth in the city had a place to go and a gift to open. "Tina, the energy in the room is incredible," Marcus said as he watched the kids laughing and sharing stories. "You've created a family where there was none." I looked at the faces of the teenagers, some of them 17, just like I had been, and I saw the same fire in their eyes. "We aren't just surviving," I told them during my speech. "We are thriving, and we are doing it together." The truth was no longer a burden. It was a bridge. My abandonment had been a transaction of greed, but my life was a testament to the power of resilience and the pursuit of a higher law. 6 months later, the federal trial of Arthur and Elena Vance began in Chicago, drawing national headlines for its exposure of the elite abandonment ring. I was the star witness, testifying with a clinical precision that left the defense with no room to maneuver. "Miss Thompson, how would you describe the Vances' involvement in the Harmony Agency?" the prosecutor asked. I looked directly at my biological parents, seated at the defense table in their muted prison grays. "They were the recruiters of heartbreak," I answered. "They sold the idea that children are disposable assets, and they profited from the destruction of families." I laid out the financial trail, the forged documents, and the psychological impact with the authority of a woman who had mastered the very system they tried to exploit. "They didn't just leave a child," I concluded. "They tried to delete a human being." The trial's conclusion was a total victory for justice. Arthur and Elena Vance were sentenced to 12 and 15 years respectively, their assets seized to pay restitution to the hundreds of children they had defrauded. The judge, a stern man who had seen the worst of human nature, didn't hold back in his sentencing. "You exploited the most fundamental trust in our society," he told them. "You turned the protection of the next generation into a criminal enterprise." When I was allowed to give my victim impact statement, I didn't speak of my pain. I spoke of the strength I had found in spite of them. "Your Honor, these defendants believed they were disposing of a burden," I said. "Instead, they were creating an adversary who would eventually hold them to account. They gave me the tools to destroy them, and for that, I am grateful. My statement was printed in every major legal journal, a defining moment in the history of child advocacy. The aftermath of the conviction brought a sense of quiet that I had never known. The Bernadette Hope Foundation received a significant portion of the seized assets, allowing us to expand our reach to foster youth across the entire country. Tina, you've changed the legal landscape for these kids forever, Professor Rossi told me during a celebratory dinner. You've made it impossible for parents to soft abandon their children without facing the full weight of the law. I had turned my suitcase into a vault of resources for others, ensuring that no child would ever have to stand on a sidewalk and wonder if they were worthy of love. It was never about revenge, I told her. It was about accountability. It was about making sure the law finally did its job. My parents' imprisonment was the end of a long, cold chapter, and the start of a story that was entirely my own. 5 years after the sentencing, a letter arrived at my office from the federal prison where Elena Vance was serving her term. It was postmarked December 20th, and the handwriting was shaky and small. Tina, I have found solace in the chapel here, and I realize now the depth of our sin, she wrote. I am asking for your forgiveness this Christmas, for the night at the gates and the years of silence. I read the letter twice, the winter sun catching the gold leaf on my mahogany desk. I didn't feel the old anger flare up, nor did I feel the urge to write back a scathing retort. Authentic remorse requires an acknowledgement of the debt, not just a plea for absolution. I filed the letter away in a folder marked closed cases, alongside the thousands of others I had handled over the years. I don't need to forgive her to be free, I told Dr. Thorne later that week. My freedom was won the day I stopped waiting for her to care. Today, 15 years after the conviction, my life is a sanctuary of the warmth I once lacked. I am the senior partner at Sterling & Thompson, and our firm is the gold standard for child advocacy law in the United States. The Bernadette Hope Foundation is a global entity protecting children from exploitation in all its forms. My husband, Dr. David Thorne, the son of my former therapist, a connection that grew from a shared dedication to healing, and our 2 adopted sons are the center of my world. Mom, why do we always go to St. Jude's on Christmas Eve? My son Leo asked as we packed boxes of toys and books. Because that's where my life really started, I told him, hugging him close. It's where I learned that even in the coldest winter, you can find the light to guide you home. My sons will never know the weight of an unwanted suitcase, because they are anchored in a love that is unconditional and ironclad. The ultimate victory wasn't the prison sentences or the seized mansions. It was the fact that I had built a life where my biological parents no longer mattered. They had sold me for $50,000, but I had built a legacy that was priceless. Their names are a footnote in the history of a criminal enterprise, while my name is a symbol of protection for the vulnerable. Tina, you have turned the worst night of your life into the best hope for thousands of others, Judge Vargas told me when I was appointed to the state Supreme Court. You are the living proof that a child's worth is not determined by those who discard them. Standing in the courtroom where I would soon take my oath, I thought of that 17-year-old girl in the Chicago snow. She wasn't waiting at the window anymore. She had opened the door and walked into a world she had made herself. Last year, on the morning of Christmas Eve, a package arrived at my office from the state-run medical facility where Arthur Vance was spending his final days under guard. Inside was the small, battered suitcase I had been holding the day they left me, along with a note asking for a final meeting so he could die with a clean conscience. For a moment, a cold, sharp impulse flared within me, the desire to go to his bedside, not to offer comfort, but to look him in the eye and tell him that even in his final hour, he was still a stranger to the woman I had become. It was the ultimate opportunity for a closing act of retribution, a chance to ensure his last memories were of the daughter who had stripped him of his freedom and his dignity. The invitation felt like a trap, a way for his shadow to touch my life one last time on the day I had spent decades trying to make joyful. I looked at my sons playing by our tree, their laughter filling a home built on unconditional love, and I realized that seeking that final confrontation would be a stain on the peace I've fought so hard to earn. To harbor spite on the anniversary of my abandonment would be to let those people dictate the rhythm of my heart, giving them power they no longer deserve. Their misery is not my responsibility, and their late-life regret is simply the natural harvest of the seeds they sowed 25 years ago. They are already living with the ghost of the child they sold, and that is a heavier sentence than any words of mine could impose. For this reason, I will never seek revenge on Christmas Day, because my happiness is the only true justice, and the silence I offer them is the only gift they have earned. Be nice. It's the Christmas season. Subscribe for more stories.